At 3:47 in the morning, the city of Doha lay beneath its usual blanket of silence. Families slept, skyscrapers glowed faintly against the Persian Gulf, and the night seemed calm. Then the sky cracked open. Israeli F-35 jets pierced the darkness, their engines roaring across sovereign airspace. Precision missiles streaked downward, and within seconds a skyline of light became a horizon of fire. Children were pulled from their beds, parents rushed into the streets, and a capital city recognized by international law suddenly looked like a battlefield. Tel Aviv quickly offered its explanation. Counterterrorism, they said. Preemptive defense, they claimed. But no slogan could disguise the reality that the sovereignty of a nation had just been shattered in front of the world. And here lies the deeper question: if a wealthy capital like Doha, with embassies and global partnerships, can be struck without warning, then what city, what continent is truly safe? For decades, smaller nations have been told to remain quiet spectators in a theater dominated by Washington and Brussels. Yet, in September 2025, something different happened. From thousands of miles away in the landlocked heart of Africa, a young leader refused to remain silent. Ibrahim Traoré of Burkina Faso picked up the phone and delivered words no one expected: Africa will not stay silent. That single act, one voice carried across satellites, did more than answer Tel Aviv. It rattled embassies, it shook defense contracts, and it sent a signal that the age of passive Africa may be ending. What began as flames in Qatar could become the dawn of a new continental awakening. So stay with us. This is not just another headline, it is a hinge of history. Please share this video if you believe you are among the first to support President Ibrahim Traoré, and subscribe if you agree that the truth is more important than the headlines. The night of September 2025 began like any other in Doha. Streets were quiet, the waterfront shimmered in the distance, and the city's skyline stretched like a crown of glass and steel across the Gulf. But at 3:47 a.m., the calm was ripped apart. Israeli F-35 fighter jets thundered over the city, firing precision-guided munitions that tore into the capital. Within minutes, towers trembled, windows shattered, and families poured into the streets in terror. What had been a city of light moments earlier transformed into a horizon ablaze with fire. Tel Aviv wasted no time in defending its actions. Officials labeled the assault a counterterrorism operation, claiming it was necessary to prevent future threats. They spoke of preemptive defense, a phrase that had been polished through decades of conflicts. Yet behind the diplomatic language lay an undeniable truth: one sovereign state had crossed into the airspace of another without warning, without provocation, and without consent. It was a violation not cloaked in ambiguity, but visible to every set of eyes watching the smoke rise above Qatar's capital. And Qatar is not Gaza. This was not an occupied strip of land constantly denied recognition. Doha is a capital city of a recognized nation with embassies, international trade agreements, and protections guaranteed by international law. To strike at its heart was to send a chilling message that no capital, no nation, no people were beyond the reach of Israeli power. It was to assume that silence would follow, just as it often had in the past when smaller nations were attacked or humiliated under the cover of security. But silence did not follow. Thousands of miles away in the city of Ouagadougou, a young African leader watched the images unfold. Ibrahim Traoré, interim president of Burkina Faso, saw the smoke twisting into the Qatari sky, saw families sprinting through shattered glass and rubble, and saw Israeli officials stand before cameras, justifying their strike with polished rhetoric. For him, it was not only about Qatar, it was a mirror reflecting back upon Africa itself. Because if a sovereign state like Qatar, wealthy, well-connected, and internationally recognized, could be attacked with impunity, then what chance did Africa's capitals have? If a strike could flatten Doha without consequence, then what was to stop the same logic from being applied to Abuja, Nairobi, or even Ouagadougou? The lesson was stark: sovereignty was only as strong as the will to defend it. At that moment, Ibrahim Traoré did something almost unthinkable in the measured world of international diplomacy. He bypassed aides, ministers, and the usual layers of protocol. Instead, he lifted the phone and called Benjamin Netanyahu directly. Few African leaders in living memory had dared such a move. His message was clear, sharp, and uncompromising. Your aircraft crossed the line. Africa will not stay silent. Those words, carried across satellites in the early hours of the morning, marked a turning point. They were not the typical cautious condemnations crafted for press releases and international summits. They were not diluted by the safe language of concern or dialogue. They were sovereignty plain and unyielding. And almost immediately the world reacted. Within 6 hours, the Israeli ambassador in Ouagadougou requested emergency meetings, desperate to gauge how serious this new posture from Burkina Faso might be. Within 12 hours, Netanyahu's own office was reaching out to the African Union, seeking urgent dialogue and reassurance. By the 24th hour, defense contractors in Tel Aviv were recalculating billions of dollars at risk in Africa. For Burkina Faso, a country often dismissed as peripheral in global politics, the message was extraordinary. Its voice mattered. For Israel, the shock was profound. The assumption had always been that Africa's reactions would remain muted, symbolic at best. But here was a leader who had broken the script, who had chosen action over caution, dignity over dependency. The attack on Doha was supposed to be another episode in the endless cycle of Middle Eastern conflict. Instead, it ignited something larger, a sense that the violation of one nation's sovereignty was an assault on all. And through the voice of Ibrahim Traoré, Africa signaled that it would no longer be silent. The call from Ouagadougou did not vanish into the static of international politics. It struck like a bolt of lightning across a sky that many had assumed would remain cloudless. In the sterile corridors of Tel Aviv, officials who were accustomed to predictable diplomatic murmurs suddenly faced something far more direct, an African leader breaking the rules of silence. Ibrahim Traoré's voice was not softened by diplomacy. "Africa will not stay silent," he declared. Those 5 words marked the crossing of a line that Israel had never expected from the continent. For decades, Africa's condemnations had been predictable, wrapped in phrases like deep concern or urgent calls for dialogue. But now, a leader had spoken the language of consequence, not caution. Within hours, consequences began to take shape. The presidential palace in Ouagadougou issued a decree that stunned observers across continents. Burkina Faso was suspending all military cooperation with Israel. Training programs were canceled overnight. Defense contracts carefully negotiated for years were terminated with immediate effect. Intelligence sharing channels were severed. In the language of geopolitics, this was not simply a rebuke. It was rupture. Tel Aviv panicked. The Israeli ambassador scrambled to secure urgent meetings, pleading for clarification. Netanyahu himself began dialing African capitals, but the calls that once would have been answered with courtesy now met cold silence. Ghana's president listened for barely a minute before ending the conversation. Nigeria's leader refused to pick up altogether. Kenya's president allowed 30 seconds before disconnecting. What once were open diplomatic lines had become walls of silence, and inside Israel's cabinet, panic set in. By the 24th hour, the tremors had spread. Defense contractors in Tel Aviv, who had grown comfortable with lucrative deals across Africa, suddenly faced losses running into billions. Projects in mineral exploration, agricultural ventures, and surveillance technology were frozen. Investors whispered of instability of Africa becoming less a passive market and more an active judge. The financial press in Israel spoke of contagion, warning that Burkina Faso's stance could inspire other nations to act decisively. And indeed, that contagion spread. Within 24 hours, 15 African leaders had issued statements echoing Traoré's condemnation. Within 48 hours, the African Union convened an emergency session. By the 72nd hour, the unthinkable occurred. African ambassadors were recalled from Tel Aviv en masse. South Africa suspended diplomatic relations. Algeria closed its airspace. Morocco severed agricultural partnerships. Nigeria canceled defense contracts worth hundreds of millions of dollars. On Israeli television, analysts admitted what officials would not. This is unprecedented. For the first time, Israel faces not scattered criticism, but coordinated retaliation from Africa. The tone was less about defending Israel's decision to strike Doha and more about how to contain the storm Africa had unleashed. And it was not only Africa that felt the tremor. In Cairo, in Tehran, in Ankara, and even across Latin America, leaders cited Africa's defiance as an inspiration. The Arab League invited Ibrahim Traoré to address their emergency session, praising his clarity and courage. Turkey lauded Africa's leadership, declaring that sovereignty had found its voice in Ouagadougou. Iran's foreign minister went further, stating, "Plainly, Africa has shown the world how sovereignty must be defended." What shocked many observers was not just the symbolism of Africa's actions, but the speed. This was not months of negotiation or years of slow-building alliances. It was rapid, decisive, and coordinated. Africa, so often dismissed as divided and dependent, had in less than a week forced Israel to confront a reality it had never planned for: a continent speaking with one voice. And in the streets of Africa, from Lagos to Dar es Salaam, ordinary citizens felt the shift. Demonstrations filled public squares, placards carried messages of solidarity with Qatar and pride in Africa's stance. For the first time in living memory, Africans saw their continent not portrayed as fractured and silent, but united and defiant. The climax was clear. What began as smoke over Doha had erupted into a storm that spanned continents. And at the center of that storm was not Washington, not Brussels, not even Doha, but Ouagadougou. Ibrahim Traoré had transformed a strike in the Middle East into a continental awakening, a declaration that sovereignty was no longer negotiable. The immediate consequences of Ibrahim Traoré's defiance were diplomatic, but beneath that surface, deeper tremors spread through civil and political life, both in Africa and beyond. For Israel, the cost was clear and measurable. Defense companies that had once boasted of lucrative contracts across the Sahel now faced cancellation notices. Mineral concessions, oil projects, and agricultural ventures tied to Israeli firms were abruptly frozen. Billions of dollars evaporated, not through war, but through boycotts. In Tel Aviv boardrooms, investors whispered the same fear: Africa had ceased to be a passive market and was now an active judge. Contracts could no longer be taken for granted, and reputational damage was mounting. For Africa, the impact was twofold. On one hand, pride swelled. Citizens across Ouagadougou, Lagos, Nairobi, and Johannesburg saw their leaders standing tall against one of the most militarized states on earth. Street demonstrations blended outrage over Israel's strike with celebrations of Africa's newfound voice. Young people carried placards declaring solidarity with Qatar, while elders spoke with pride that for once Africa was not silent, but leading the moral charge. For many, it was the first time in living memory that their continent was not portrayed as divided and dependent, but as united and defiant. On the other hand, risks loomed. American officials began signaling reductions in security assistance. European diplomats quietly hinted that aid packages might be reconsidered. International lenders, never neutral in such matters, raised questions about the stability of African markets. The pressure was not subtle. If Africa insisted on charting its own course, then Africa might pay an economic price. Inside Burkina Faso, the tension was palpable. The nation already struggled with insurgencies, displacement, and fragile infrastructure. Critics whispered that Traoré's boldness might invite destabilization or even retaliation. Supporters countered that dignity outweighed dependency, that sovereignty meant little if it could be silenced by fear of losing aid. In market squares and village gatherings, debates flourished. Was sovereignty worth the economic cost? Could a small, landlocked country bear the burden of leading a continental revolt? For Traoré, the answer was unequivocal. Sovereignty could not be halfway claimed. To condemn without consequence was to surrender in silence. Yet with each firm step came new dangers. Intelligence reports carried whispers of plots, and international analysts speculated openly about the possibility of an assassination attempt against the young leader. The threat of violence became as real as the pressure of diplomacy. Domestically, however, the political impact was undeniable. In a country long accustomed to Western lectures and dependency, citizens now watched their president dictate terms to global powers. Confidence in the presidency surged. Opposition voices found little ground to stand on, for to criticize Traoré's move risked appearing to side with foreign interests against national dignity. What had begun as external defiance reshaped the internal balance of power. Regionally, fault lines also began to shift. Some African governments heavily reliant on Western aid hesitated, wary of the risks. Others, emboldened by Burkina Faso's example, aligned decisively with the new momentum. The African Union itself found its hand forced into a new reality. No longer could it survive on symbolic resolutions. It was now expected to back words with deeds, and for the first time in its history, it did. Beyond the halls of politics, the ripple effects reached ordinary families. In Qatar, civilians displaced by the strike received shipments of food and medical aid from African partners. Though modest in scale, the gesture carried symbolic weight far exceeding its material value. It was Africa saying, "We see you and we stand with you." In Burkina Faso itself, families began discussing Qatar as if it were kin, another victim of aggression, another partner deserving of defense. On social media, young Africans reframed the narrative. No longer was Africa the continent of silence. It was the continent of consequence. Hashtags linking Ouagadougou to Doha trended globally, while murals and street art depicted Africa as the shield of sovereignty. The cost of defiance was undeniable. Prices of imports crept upward. Foreign loans became harder to negotiate. Pressure from Washington and Brussels whispered in every diplomatic corridor. Yet the pride of ordinary Africans was equally undeniable. For once, they were not pawns. They were players. When Africa raised its voice, the ripple was felt far beyond the continent. What began as a strike in Doha, answered by a phone call from Ouagadougou, quickly became a diplomatic storm that stretched from Washington to Beijing. The United States moved first. State Department officials placed urgent calls to African capitals, warning that overreaction threatened regional stability. CIA envoys traveled quietly to remind presidents of military agreements, counterterrorism, partnerships, and aid packages. The message was blunt: temper your defiance or face the cost. Washington had long assumed that Africa could be pressured back into alignment with threats of suspended funding or security assistance. Yet this time the strategy faltered. Rather than softening, African leaders stood taller, buoyed by the momentum of continental unity. The reversal of history was striking: no longer Africa bending to external pressure, but America discovering the limits of its leverage. Europe, by contrast, hesitated. In Brussels, leaders issued cautious statements about the need for dialogue and de-escalation. Yet conspicuously absent was any direct condemnation of Israel's strike. For many Africans, the silence spoke louder than words. It confirmed what they had long suspected: that justice in Europe is too often filtered through the lens of political convenience. Where Africa had acted decisively, Europe clung to neutrality. The contrast was impossible to ignore. Elsewhere, reactions were far more enthusiastic. The Arab League convened an emergency session and extended an unprecedented invitation to President Ibrahim Traoré to address its members. In Cairo, leaders praised his courage. In Tehran, the foreign minister declared, "Africa shows the world how sovereignty should be defended." Turkey lauded Africa's defiance, arguing that smaller nations had reminded the global order of principles long buried beneath power politics. Even across Latin America, presidents drew parallels between Africa's stand and their own histories of resistance against imperial pressure. For Israel, the fallout was severe. The foreign minister dispatched delegations to Cairo, Abuja, and Nairobi, desperate to salvage ties. Defense Minister Yoav Gallant personally flew to several African capitals, only to be met with cold receptions, cancellations, and refusals. On Israeli television, analysts admitted the obvious: Africa had become a diplomatic front that Tel Aviv could no longer afford to ignore. This was not scattered discontent. It was coordinated resistance. International media amplified the story. Headlines from the Washington Post to Al Jazeera highlighted Africa's unprecedented retaliation. Social media surged with images of African flags flying alongside Qatar's skyline. Hashtags linking Ouagadougou and Doha went viral. A single phrase captured the moment: "This is not just Qatar's fight. This is sovereignty's test everywhere." Yet admiration abroad was coupled with unease. Global powers now faced an urgent question: how should they engage with a continent that had shifted from passive observer to active participant? Would they attempt to isolate Africa through sanctions, divide it with selective partnerships, or finally recognize that 54 nations representing 1? 4 billion people could no longer be dismissed as marginal China, and Russia watched closely, weighing opportunities. Beijing, with its vast infrastructure projects, hinted at expanding its role as Africa's economic partner if Western aid receded. Moscow, already deepening ties through security cooperation, praised Africa's courage and pledged to support its sovereignty at international forums. The multipolar world order, often spoken of but rarely seen, suddenly felt more tangible. The smoke over Doha eventually cleared, but the consequences of that night remained alive in Washington's anxiety, Brussels' hesitation, Tel Aviv's shock, and Ankara's praise. The clash was no longer about Israel and Qatar alone. It had become a question of whether sovereignty, long dismissed as rhetoric, could redefine international order in practice. Africa had spoken. The world, willingly or not, was forced to listen. The roar of Israeli jets over Doha has faded, but its echoes still roll across continents. What began as a midnight strike in the Gulf has become a dawn of reckoning for Africa and the world. From Ouagadougou, a young leader turned a single phone call into a continental awakening, proving that even the smallest nations can force the powerful to pause. Yet the path forward is uncertain. Pressure from Washington will not disappear. Brussels may continue to hesitate. Tel Aviv will surely remember. And even within Africa, cracks could appear as some governments weigh short-term relief against long-term principle. The threats are real: economic sanctions, aid suspensions, even whispers of assassination attempts against President Ibrahim Traoré. History reminds us that those who resist entrenched power often pay the highest price. But there is also opportunity. For the first time in decades, Africa is not simply reacting, it is defining. New partnerships beckon across the Arab world, Asia, and Latin America. Citizens across the continent are seeing themselves not as pawns but as players in the shaping of tomorrow's order. The soil of sovereignty has been turned. The seeds of dignity have been sown. Whether they grow into a harvest of unity or wither under external pressure will depend on what Africa chooses next. So we turn to you. Do you think that President Ibrahim Traoré's strategies for reform and defiance are truly effective, yet can Africa continue to trust his leadership, or should we prepare for someone else to carry the mantle? Please share this video if you feel you are among the first to support President Ibrahim Traoré. And subscribe if you believe that the truth is more important than the headlines. Together, let us keep this conversation alive because history does not wait, and neither can we.